Meteor Strike by Donald E. Westlake. The cargo was crated for delivery at Los Angeles, where the workers didn't consider it anything special. In the company where they worked, this particular cargo was of the type called a standing repeater. That is, a new order was shipped out every 6 months, regular as clockwork. First, the order department mailed off a suggested list of specifications to the General Transit's Limited main office in Tangiers. Next, the list came back, usually with a few substitutions inked in, and was sent down to L.A., to the warehouse, for the specific items to be crated for shipment. There were 7 aluminum crates in the cargo, each a 3-foot cube. Aluminum was still the lightest feasible crating material, and this cargo was destined for the quartermaster base orbiting the moon. The 7 crates left the warehouse by helicopter, and were flown north to the airport midway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. There they spent 32 hours in another warehouse before being flown to the Tangiers Po. Even in nomenclature, man made it apparent that his thoughts these days were ever outward, away from Earth. The spaceport on Earth was called Tangiers Po, which stood for Port of Embarkation. The spaceport on the moon was called Moonpod, for Port of Debarkation. It was as though man didn't want to admit that he still had to make the round trip. The cargo arrived at the Tangiers Po a day ahead of schedule, and spent one more night in a warehouse. Across the field, the 4 lighters from Station 1 were being unloaded. Their cargo was almost exclusively manufactured items from the factories on the moon. Manufacturers had discovered, to their astonishment, that the lighter gravity and the accessible vacuum and the ready availability of free raw materials on the moon more than offset the additional cost of labor and buildings and transportation. In the last 15 years, the moon had become studded with heavily automated factories, producing everything from delicate electronic equipment to razor blades. Though human exploitation of the moon had begun as a military venture, back in the late 1960s, by 1994, it had been taken over almost completely by commercial interests. A few of the cartons being unloaded across the field were samples or data from the scientific teams on the moon. These teams, all affiliated with one university or another, were for the most part supported by the manufacturers themselves. As at all times in the past, commercial business success had been shortly followed by commercial philanthropy. A part of the profits of what one newspaper columnist had dubbed the moon-ufacturers were siphoned off to give scientists an opportunity and a freedom for research and investigation unavailable through any short-range government grant. There were as yet no tourist facilities either for travel to the moon nor for a stay on the moon. A rumor was current that a number of hotel and restaurant corporations were banding together to found a moon resort, but so far nothing had come of it. The 7 aluminum crates spent the night in the Po warehouse, and in the morning were turned over to Glenn Blair, whose charge they would be for the next 33 days, until they reached the quartermaster base. Glenn Blair was a big man, big-boned and fully fleshed, with a short cropped head of light hair. 34 years of age, he had been for the last 7 years one of the 2 chief cargo masters for General Transit's Limited, the franchised operator of the Earth-Moon transportation system. He came into the warehouse now with Cy Braddock, the Po cargo chief, and the 2 of them compared the stacked crates half filling the warehouse with the manifest flimsies attached to Braddock's, checking off each item as they found it. When they came to the 7 crates from Los Angeles, Blair said, "Cargo for QB. Let's see, what's the specification?" He read the line on the manifest and grinned. "I forgot it was time for another shipment. 6 months already." He patted the nearest of the 7 crates. "The boys at QB will be happy to see you fellas," he said. Braddock looked over his shoulder and read the specification. "What's so important about that stuff? I thought that was low priority." "Check your regs, Cy. These fellas are priority number 1. If they don't get to quarterback, there'll be hell to pay. Within a month, QB would be more dangerous than a cannibal village." Braddock shook his head. "You people have a funny set of values," he said. "The more I know about you, the happier I am to stay right here. Come on, let's finish the checkout and get loading. Takeoff is scheduled for 11:17. They finished the first checking of the cargo, and went on out of the shed and across the sun-baked tarmac toward the lighter. The Tangiers Po was a great concrete oval, ringed by warehouse sheds and repair huts and administration buildings. All of Earth's space shipping was conducted here, close to the Mediterranean coast of North Africa, where perfect flight conditions were rarely marred by clouds or rain or cold. Where flight plans include 3 variables: a lighter moving from a moving Earth to a moving space station. No one can afford delays caused by bad weather. In the shed, the cargo handlers loaded small open-sided carts, which were then driven across the field to the lighter. The cargo for QB came out on the second cart, and Glenn Blair supervised its careful stowing and tying down in the hold, then made the second check after its specification line on the manifest. The first checkmark meant that he had found the 7 crates in undamaged condition in the shed. The second one meant that he had accepted delivery onto the lighter. 8 more checkmarks would be made before the cargo was finally delivered to QB. All cargo and personnel traveling between the Earth and the Moon made the trip in 5 stages. Stage 1 was transit from the surface of the Earth to the space station, aboard a torpedo-shaped ship familiarly known as a lighter. Stage 2 was aboard the station during its 15-day trip from perigee, 400 miles up, to apogee, 84,000 miles from Earth. Space stations 1 and 2 circled the Earth, one at perigee whenever the other was at apogee, so that a shipment left for the Moon every 15 days. Stage 3 was via a ship technically known as VTV, vacuum to vacuum, but informally called the barbell because of its shape. This stage also took 15 days and covered 62,000 miles, terminating at its meeting with Space Station 3, 84,000 miles from the Moon. Station 3 orbited the Moon every 15 days, so that this lap of the trip, Stage 4, took 7.5 days. And finally, Stage 5, via another lighter, was from Station 3 at perigee, 250 miles above the Moon, to the surface of the Moon itself. Or, as in the case of the 7 aluminum crates from Los Angeles, from Station 3 to Quartermaster Base, the maintenance satellite for the whole system, in permanent orbit 200 miles above the surface of the Moon. Although it had taken 4 lighters, this trip, to bring down to the Po the shipment of manufactured goods and scientific samples from the Moon, only 1 lighter was required for the return shipment. The Moon colony was not yet self-supporting, but the first steps in that direction had already been made. A part of the colony's food was homegrown, hydroponically. New plant buildings and new machinery were built right on the Moon, by firms whose only customers were other Moon companies. Clothing and furnishings were made of synthetics. Most of the moon-bound cargo was paperwork of one sort or another. There was the 15 days accumulation of mail for the Moon personnel, sheafs of new product specifications for the managers of the Moon plants, financial reports, and so on. The rest, except for the cargo for quarterback, was primarily food, meat, and dairy products and other foods unavailable through hydroponics. There were also 3 engineers, new employees of Interplanetal Business Machines, replacing 3 men whose 2-year contracts were ending and who would be coming back to Earth on the next transit. Blair greeted the 3 men at the lighter ramp, checking their names and identity cards against the manifest, and then saying, "My name's Blair, Glenn Blair. I'm cargo master on this trip, and you boys are part of the cargo. You've got any questions or problems, bring them to me. I'm liaison between you and the rest of the transit personnel, okay?" One of the engineers said, "If we decide we can't take it, we shouldn't bug the working types. Is that it?" "You're Rix?" "Yes, Rix, that's exactly it. None of you people have been off-planet before, so you can't make any sure statements about how you'll act. A good quarter of our first-time passengers are plenty scared. It's nothing to be ashamed of. If any of you feel it getting to you, come to me. Don't try to burrow your way through the wall. Don't try to kill yourself. Don't go running around screaming. We've had all of that, at one time or another, and it plays merry hell with the working day." Rix grinned. "If I need a shoulder to cry on, Mr. Blair," he said, "I'll run straight to you." "You do that. Come on, I'll show you your quarters." Blair led the way up the ramp and into the lighter. The bottom half of the ship was engine and fuel space, and most of the upper half was cargo hold, leaving only 2 levels at the top for human occupancy. The uppermost level was the control room, with passenger space on the level beneath. The 3 engineers, Rix in the lead, followed Blair up the inside ladder to the second level, a smallish circular room with 12 bunks in tiers of 3 around the walls. The center space was empty. "There's only 4 of us," said Blair, "so we can all take middle bunks. The middle's best. There's less noise and vibration. Beds for the babies, is that it? Said Rix. Blair grinned at him. You wouldn't want to be standing up when we blast, he said. Now, you lie face down in these bunks. This indentation is for your knees, and this pillow up here is for your chin. You hold onto these handles here in front of the pillow, and you brace your feet against this bar back here. Just before we blast, you dig your chin down into that pillow hard. If you have your mouth open, you're liable to get up to the station minus a few teeth. In front of each bunk here, you see these 3 lights. The green one means you can relax, talk if you want to, readjust your position, whatever you want. The orange one means a blast within 1 minute, and the red one means a blast within 10 seconds. The red one stays on throughout a blast, okay? Rick said. The company had us play with these cribs. They filled us in pretty good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm always pleased to get my human cargo to the pod alive. Let's get into the bunks now and get ourselves ready. Blast is due in a couple minutes. Blair saw to it that the 3 engineers were properly situated in their bunks, and then he crawled into the one nearest Rick's. He had the feeling that young man would be needing his hand held in just a few minutes. Harvey Rix was not a crybaby. Way back in grammar school, he was known as the kid who couldn't be made to cry. A lot of the other kids tried it, and some of them were pretty ingenious, but no one ever succeeded. Harvey Rix was not a crybaby. He didn't cry when he flunked out of MIT either, in the first semester of his sophomore year. He wanted to, God knows, but he didn't. He simply packed his gear and went on home, and spent 6 months thinking it over. Until the MIT fiasco, schoolwork had always come readily to him. He'd never had to do much studying, and so he'd never learned the methods or picked up the habit. He'd managed to breeze through his secondary schooling with natural intelligence and smooth glibness, and he'd tried the same technique at college. It hadn't worked. During those 6 months at home, he'd learned why it hadn't worked. He still had his textbooks, and he spent a lot of time with them. Not so much out of a desire to learn, as out of a nostalgia for the school that had rejected him. Gradually he began to see where he'd gone wrong. He was at a level of learning now where natural intuition and glibness weren't enough. There were facts and concepts and relationships in those textbooks that he just couldn't pick up in a rapid glossing of the subject matter, and there were other things in the textbooks that he couldn't even understand until he had a sure grip on the earlier work. 6 months of brain beating in his own home finally did for him what 13 years of formal schooling had not done. It taught him how to study, and it taught him why to study. At the end of that time, he was accepted by a lesser engineering school in the northeastern United States, and this time, he did it right. In this second school, however, he was known as the boy who'd flunked out of MIT. It was much the same as his reputation for non-crying in childhood. He hadn't really wanted then to be known as the boy who wouldn't cry. All he'd really wanted was for people not to try to make him cry. But he hadn't known how to manage that, and so he'd built up a brittle sort of bravado, a challenging attitude that was actually only the other side of the crying coin. The bravado was still his only defense when he was known as the boy who'd flunked out of MIT. His whole attitude seemed to say, "So what? I'm still a smarter, better engineer than all the rest of you clods combined, and that goes for you fourth-rate teachers too." As a result, he had plenty of time for studying. No one at school was particularly anxious for his company. The funny part of it was that he was right. As a child, the other kids couldn't make him cry. As an engineering student, he was better than anyone else in his class. After 2 semesters, with a string of A marks to his credit, he reapplied at MIT and was accepted on a probationary basis. He graduated 7th in his class, held back only by his poor freshman marks, and was immediately snapped up by Interplanetal Business Machines. Interplanetal ran him through the normal engineer trainee courses, familiarizing him with the company's line of equipment. He sailed through, fascinated by this actual concrete usage of what had been only theoretical knowledge at school. And since he finished first in his class, he was given his choice of geographical area of assignment. By now, bravado was an ingrained characteristic of Harvey Rix. Interplanetal maintained a moon division, which built computers and office equipment for lease to the other moon industries, and all personnel there were volunteers on a 2-year contract. It was inevitable that Harvey Rix would volunteer. Throughout his life, bravado had made him do what he could, but didn't want to do. He could hold the tears back, though he didn't want to have to, and his attitude had forced him to prove it, time and time again. He could buckle down and study, though he'd have preferred to loaf, and his own challenge to his classmates had forced him to do it. He could spend 2 years on the moon, though he would much rather have lived that time in New York or San Jose, and so here he was on his way to the moon. He tried to stop himself from being such a wise guy, but he always failed. Before he knew what was happening, he'd have his mouth wide open and his foot in it up to the knee, like with this cargo master Blair. He hadn't wanted to bait the man. He hadn't wanted to show off and act the smart aleck, but he'd done it just the same. If, at any time in the next month of the journey, he felt himself slipping, he'd have no one to stiffen his backbone for him but himself. If he'd only kept his mouth shut and minded his own business, he could have relaxed, knowing that an older and wiser hand was always there, ready and willing to help him keep his balance. This way, as usual, he had put himself in the position where he had to rely totally on himself. Lying face down in the bunk, chin on the squarish foam rubber pillow, he eyed the 3 lights in front of him grimly and silently, cursed himself for 47 kinds of fool. He was the reverse of the boy who cried wolf too much. He cried wolf too seldom. One of these days he would send all the hunters away and a wolf would come along too big for him to handle by himself. That day, Harvey Ricks would have his reckoning. He wondered if the day was coming sometime in the next month. The orange light flashed on. Behind him, the voice of the cargo master came softly, talking to them all. "You fellows take it easy now," he was saying. "Breathe deep and slow. Don't get all tensed up. Don't hold on to those handles so tight you bunch your shoulder muscles all up. Don't try to kick those foot bars right off the bunks. Just relax. If you tense your bodies all up, you'll take a lot worse licking than if you just lie easy. You can get yourselves a broken bone just by being too tense when we blast. Inhale slow and easy now. Exhale slow and easy. Just keep a light grip on the handles. Lie easy and relaxed, like you were going to doze off in a minute." The voice droned softly in the small room, and Ricks knew the man was trying to relax them just by the sound of his voice. But for Ricks, with his perverse bravado, it had just the opposite effect. His body kept tensing up, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His hands, gripping the chrome-plated handles as though they would snap them in two, were sweating already, and his shoulders were aching with strain. His feet pushed so hard against the bar that his knees were completely off the bunk. "I'm going to panic," he thought. "I'm going to scream. I'm going to jump up off this bunk and get myself killed when we blast." Only shame kept him in the bunk. Only shame kept the scream unsounded in his throat. He had acted the big shot with the cargo master, acted the know-it-all. He couldn't give in. He couldn't turn around and show himself a phony and a weakling. The red light flicked on. Sweat ribboned down his face. The back of his shirt clung to him, soaked through with perspiration. His collar was too tight, cutting off air, and his belt buckle was grinding into his middle. He pushed his chin down into the pillow and stared at the red light. He had to swallow. His mouth was full of saliva. But he was afraid to. If he was swallowing when the blast came, he could strangle. That had happened in the past, more than once. Perspiration stung his eyes, but he was afraid to blink. He had to keep staring at the red light, staring at the red light. A heavy iron press slammed into his back, grinding him down into the bunk, stomping his feet down off the bar, shoving his face into the pillow. His mouth was full of saliva, dribbling out now between his lips, staining the pillow, mixing with his perspiration. The bunched muscles of his shoulders whined in agony, and his hands, numb now, slipped from the handles and lay limp, fingers curled, before his eyes. The red light was still on, waving and changing as he tried to keep watching it. His eyes burned, and despite himself, the lids came down, as though weighted with heavy magnets. With closed eyes came nausea. He had no equilibrium anymore, no balance. There was no longer any up or down, there was only himself, crushed between the bunk and the heavy iron press. He held his breath, closed his throat, kept it down. Breakfast swirled and lumped in his stomach, wanting to come up, but he kept it down. He couldn't have it. He couldn't stand it. To have the cargo master see him lying in his own sickness, he kept it down. The iron press went away, with a suddenness that terrified him. He could breathe again. He could swallow. He could move his arms and legs. He could wipe the sweat out of his eyes and look at the blessed green light. The cargo master was on his feet in the middle of the room, by the ladder, saying, Okay, fellows, that's it for a while. We'll be at a steady 1G for a while now. There'll be another little jolt in maybe 20 minutes when we come into phase with the station. In the meantime, you all can rest easy. One of the other two, Standish, said timidly, "Excuse me, do you have any, bags?" "Sure thing. Right in that little slot under the light panel." "Thank you. Don't feel bad. You haven't really been initiated into space till you've lost at least one meal. How are you other two doing?" "Okay, I guess," said Miller, the third one. "Fine. And you, Rix?" "I'm doing just lovely. This is a great little old roller coaster you've got here." Blair grinned. "I thought you'd like it," he said. Harvey Rix had proved himself again. Station 1 was leaving perigee, hurtling around the Earth on the long elliptical curve that would take it, 15 days from now, 84,000 miles towards the Moon. The lighter came curving up from Earth into the path of the station's orbit and 50 miles ahead. As the station overtook it, it slowly increased its speed, until the two were neck and neck. Slowly, the lighter pilot maneuvered his ship closer to the station until the magnetic grapples caught, holding the ship to the curving grid jutting out from the hatchway in the high center of the donut. A closed companionway slid out along the grid, attached itself to the airlock in the side of the lighter, and formed a hermetic seal. The lock was open, and the station cargo handlers came aboard for the unloading. The 7 aluminum crates of the cargo for QB were stacked on a powered cart, driven across the companionway to the station proper, and taken by elevator down 2 levels, thence down one of the 3 interior corridors to the outer ring, and were finally stowed in Section 5, with the rest of the shipment. Glenn Blair and the station manager, Irv Mendel, oversaw the unloading, making the appropriate row of checkmarks as each item was transferred from lighter to station. Blair then went back up and got the 3 engineers, all of whom seemed a little shaken by this first stage of the journey, though Rix was doing his best to hide it. "Don't worry," Blair assured them. "The worst part of the trip is done with. From now on, it's quarter G all the way." Standish, who had so far been sick twice and who was now holding tight to the nearest support, as though afraid he might float up and out of sight any minute, grinned weakly and said, "I don't know which is worse, too much gravity or too little. Do people really get used to this?" "In a couple of days," Blair told him, "you'll be running around as happy as a feather in an updraft. Once you get used to it, there's nothing in the universe as much fun as weighing only 1/4 what you're used to." "I hope I get used to it soon," said Standish, "before I starve to death." Blair led the way down the ladder and through the companionway to the station. The 3 passengers were introduced to Irv Mendel, who told them how much they'd enjoy quarter G in a couple days, and then they were shown their cubicles in Section 1, which would be their home for the next 15 days. Their luggage, 38 pounds permissible, had preceded them into the rooms, which were small but functional. There was, in each room, a bed and a chair and a small writing table, a lamp and a narrow closet, and a tiny bathroom complete with shower stall and WC. The floor was uncarpeted black plastic, and the walls and ceiling were cream-painted metal. It took the engineers a while to get used to the idea that the floor was not what they would have thought of as the bottom of the station from the outside. The floor of their cubicles was on the outside, the outer edge of the station. The center of the station was not to the left or right, it was directly overhead. The outer ring of the station was divided into 12 sections. Sections 9, 10, and 11 housed the permanent station personnel, including the weathermen and television relay men and so on. Sections 5, 6, and 7 were cargo holds, and Sections 1, 2, and 3 were transient quarters. The 3 engineers were in Section 2. Sections 4, 8, and 12 contained the utilities, the sources of light and heat and air, as well as the chow hall and food storage. At the bulkhead separating each section, floor and ceiling met at an angle of 30 degrees. A man could do a loop-the-loop simply by walking dead ahead down the main corridor until he came back to his starting point. Once the 3 engineers were safely settled in their cubicles, Blair took the elevator back up to the center of the station, where Irv Mendel was waiting for him in his office. Blair went through the same sort of paperwork as he'd done with Cy Braddock, and when they were finished, Mendel said, "How are these 3 kids? Going to give us any trouble?" "I'm not sure. Standish has a pretty weak stomach. It may take him a while to get adjusted, but I think he'll just grin and bear it. Miller's all right. I'm not too sure about Rix. He's pushing himself a little hard. One of these guys who wants to be an old salt before he ever gets into the water. If he cracks, he may do it in style. Mendel leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head. You know, he said. When I was a kid, all I ever wanted was to get out here in space. I grew up reading about moonshots and orbiting satellites, and I thought, by golly, there's the frontier of tomorrow. There's where the adventurers are going to be. The explorers and the prospectors and the soldiers of fortune. That's the place for me, boy. Romance and adventure. That's the way I saw it. He grinned and shook his head. I forgot all about the 20th century's most significant invention. Red tape. It never even occurred to me that space would be a job like this. Paperwork all over the place. Schedules to meet and financial reports to make out. Young, fuzzy-faced kids to be nursemaided. It never even occurred to me. If you hate it so much, Blair told him, why not go on back to Earth? Are you kidding? Do you know what I weigh down there? 214 pounds. Maybe more by now, I'm not sure. Besides, it's even worse down there. Paperwork up to your nose. It's only half that high up here. If you know what I mean. I know what you mean. Lighter gone? Long gone. Halfway back to Earth by now. Left while you were with your Boy Scouts. So we're on our way again? Blair got lazily to his feet and stretched. After a couple days on Earth, he said, Quarter G feels like a good quiet drunk. Think I'll go lie down in the rack and think about philosophy. See you later. Right. Hey, by the way. Blair turned at the door. By what way? This is your last round trip, isn't it? Your 2 years are up. It was up last trip. I recontracted. Mendel grinned. Member of the club now, huh? I thought you'd do that. Welcome aboard. Blair shrugged self-consciously. You know how it is, he said. Every time I go back, Earth gets a little heavier. Besides, I like the soft life. You want it really soft, Mendel told him. You put in for station duty. All we do is float around and around, draw our pay, and look at the pretty scenery. If that boy Rix blows up, Blair said, we'll both have plenty to do. I'm going to rack out. I'll see you later. See you, nursemaid. Blair took the elevator down to the outer ring and went to his cubicle in Section 2, next to the one occupied by Rix, across the corridor from Standish and Miller. He stretched out on his bed and half dozed as his body gradually got reoriented to quarter gravity. 20 minutes later, the meteor hit. It should never have happened. The station had full radar vision, and so the meteor should have been seen long before it struck. The station was powered, and should have been able to goose itself out of the meteor's path. So it should never have happened. But it did. It was one of those 1,000,000-to-1 shots. The meteor, a chunk of space rock about 6 feet in diameter, had come boiling across the solar system, past the Sun and the 2 innermost planets, headed on a near-collision course with Earth. It had actually dipped into the Earth's atmosphere, which slowed it somewhat, but not enough for it to be captured by Earth's gravity. It had shot out of the atmosphere again, moving more slowly than before, now red-hot from atmospheric friction. And shortly thereafter, it plowed into the space station from behind. From the moment it had first become a potential danger to the station, it had been unseeable. It was directly between the station and the massive ball of Earth. It was the one thin segment of space where the radar's vision was unclear, and it was out of that segment that the juggernaut had come. The impact could have been worse. In the first place, the meteor was not now traveling at its normal top speed. In the second place, the meteor and the station were traveling in approximately the same direction, so that the station, in effect, rolled with the punch. The space rock broke through the outer hull. Whether or not it penetrated the inner hull, no one was immediately sure. The strike was in Section 5, containing the cargo, with it the 7 aluminum crates for QB. At the instant of impact, even before the meteor had ground to a halt, an alarm bell rang in Section 5. The bell meant that the bulkhead doors to that section would be closed in 10 seconds. There was only one person in Section 5 at the time, a crewman named Gilmore, who'd been checking the security of the lashings on the cargo. Constant strike drills had made his reaction immediate and instinctive. He ran for the nearest door. He made it too, all but his left shoe. The bulkhead door neatly snicked off the heel of the shoe as it slammed across the doorway and sealed shut. Gilmore's shoe was ruined and his sock slightly grazed, but his foot was untouched. Throughout the rest of the station, another bell was ringing, this one with a deeper tone and a two-beat rhythm. Harvey Ricks heard it and leaped up from his bunk, forgetting the discomfort that hadn't yet abated, despite the cheery words of the cargo-master and the station manager. The bell rang on, and Ricks stood quivering in his cubicle, body tensed for fight or flight, mind bewildered and frightened. The cubicle door jolted open, and Blair's face stuck in long enough for him to shout, "Suit up! It's under your bunk!" Then he was gone again, and Ricks heard him delivering the same call to Standish and Miller across the corridor. Ricks, incredibly grateful for any excuse to be in motion, lunged across the cubicle toward his bunk. He misjudged the force of his leap with the lesser gravity, and tumbled head over heels across the bunk and into the metal wall. He lay crouched on the bunk, gripping his knees, and whispered desperately to himself, "Take it easy. Take it easy. Take it easy." When he could move without trembling, he got to his feet and dragged the spacesuit out from under the bunk. In the company course, preparatory to leaving on this trip, he'd learned how to don a spacesuit, and he clambered rapidly into this one, closing the inner and outer zippers, and then searched under the bunk again and dragged out the helmet. As he got to his feet, the bell stopped. Ricks bit down hard on his lower lip, willing himself to be calm. Carefully, he donned the helmet and went through the series of safety checks he'd been taught. Faceplate open, he put his fingers to the row of buttons at the suit's waist. First finger, left hand, helmet lamp. It worked. He could see it shining against the opposite wall. Click off. First finger, right hand, air intake. It worked. He could hear the faint hissing below his right ear. Cautiously, he closed the faceplate and inhaled. The oxygen mixture was rich, but good. Click off, faceplate open. Second finger, left hand, heat unit. It worked. He could immediately feel the suit warming against his legs and arms. Click off. Second finger, right hand, water intake. It worked. A thin dribble of lukewarm water emerged from the tube in the corner of his mouth. Click off. So far, so good. He hunched his left shoulder forward and read the small dials there. Oxygen tanks, full. Water tank, half full. Battery, fully charged. Temperature inside the suit, 68 degrees. Was the air in the cubicle getting foul? Ricks snapped the faceplate shut, pushed the air intake button. This air was cleaner, he was sure of it. Where were the others? Where was Blair? He couldn't hear a sound. The suit cut out all external atmosphere, but not all external sound. He reached up under the helmet chin and switched on the suit radio. A faint crackling of static told him it was on, but other than that there was no sound. He looked around the cubicle. Was there any air in it now? He could be standing in total vacuum, there was no way to be sure. He could be the only one still alive in the station. Blair? His own voice, confined within the helmet, sounded harsh and croaking in his ears. The radio gave no answer. Unwillingly, he moved toward the door. In here, the sound of his pounding heart was magnified, frightening him more than the radio's silence, or the thought that the station might now be airless. He pushed open the door and saw Blair standing in the corridor, wearing his spacesuit, but holding the helmet casually in his left hand. Blair looked at him and grimaced, then motioned for Ricks to open his faceplate. Ricks reached up, switched off the radio, and removed his helmet. He managed a grin. "Kinda nice in here," he said. "Set up a bar, put a couple of chairs around. It could be real livable." But he heard the tremor in his voice, and he knew that Blair heard it too. Blair said, "Get on down by the elevator with Standish and Miller. If you hear another bell, a few notes lower than the first one, with a triple beep in it, clap the helmet on. Otherwise, keep it off. You don't have canned air to waste." "Watch for the triple beep," said Ricks jauntily. "Aye, aye, sir." Blair grunted and turned away, heading down the corridor in the opposite direction. Ricks watched him go, glaring at his back. "I'm a better man than you, Harvey Ricks," said that back. "You'll break down. You'll flunk my course. You'll never match me or even come close." Blair disappeared, through the bulkhead doorway to Section 3, and Rix turned the other way, walking down the corridor and right to the elevator. Standish and Miller were standing there, helmets on, but faceplates open, and Rix felt somewhat better. His helmet was in his hand. As he came up to them, Standish said, "What do you suppose it is?" His pale face was even paler now, his large eyes larger. Rix shrugged. "It's probably just a drill. Get us new boys all lathered up, just in case we weren't taking it all seriously." "I thought I felt a tremor just before the bell started," said Miller. "We may have been hit by a meteor or some such thing." Rix shrugged again. "Whatever it was, it doesn't seem very urgent. Did Papa Blair tell you too about the triple beep?" "Sure," said Miller. "He was sore at you because you were late getting out in the hall." "I was running my suit check," said Rix easily. "Oh my gosh," cried Standish. "I forgot." He started the check right then and there. This concludes the first part of 2 total of Meteor Strike by Donald E. Westlake, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.